We are reconvening after lunch. No sleeping allowed. Oh, are these on?
Right here.
Oh.
Go ahead. I just haven't seen her for a while.
So, are you guys ready to go? Yeah. Cindy, are we, yeah, we are. I can hear my voice now. Okay. So, Kyle and Harmony, you're going to update us on the Upper Deschutes Basin, and then I guess the rest of these folks are going to come up after you? Okay, got it. Thank you.
I want to just kind of put this in a little bit of context. We have both this item E and item F, where you're going to hear a report out on the groundwater mitigation program, both dealing with the Deschutes Basin, both dealing with water issues that are very important for the communities there, but both looking at things a little bit differently. And what I wanted to just reference briefly is that there's a lot going on in the Deschutes Basin, as you'll hear from these reports, and it's both encouraging in terms of the level of engagement at the basin level by the folks there who are working through issues. It's also challenging in terms of the dynamics that we have in terms of multiple listed species, groundwater, surface water connectivity, the interest in terms of looking at issues holistically, which is something that the state and the Warm Springs tribes have been very interested in, and was part of the Deschutes Basin Summit, which is referenced in the director's update, and occurred just last month in Redmond, where we had about 150 folks locally show up who are interested, who are leaders and participants in water issues in the basin. Talk about what's going on in the upper, mid, and lower basin below Pelton Round Butte, and talked about how, so it was a really good opportunity to kind of hear what's going on in some detail, and to also hear the different interests and concerns that folks have in terms of the water issues in the basin. So there is opportunity, I think, in the spirit of place-based planning that we were talking about earlier. There's been long-standing collaboration in the Deschutes Basin, and I am very encouraged by the conversations that I had at the Deschutes Summit in terms of continuing interest in collaborative-based approaches, and I think there's opportunity for us to be thinking in those terms as we listen to the conversation here with this study, as well as with the groundwater mitigation program. Both opportunities, I think, for us to be thinking big and to be thinking holistically with respect to the Deschutes Basin. So I'll leave it at that, but and let these guys go forward with the item E.
For the record, I'm Harmony Burritt. I'm a planning coordinator with the department.
And I'm Kyle Gorman. I'm a region manager out of the South Central region, which includes the Deschutes Basin, Klamath, and Lake counties. So today, we're just going to give, Harmony and I are going to give a brief overview of the basin study, and then we have some of our colleagues are going to come up and really get into the details. So our purpose is really just to give you an overview and whet your appetite or pique your interest in what's going on in the study. So if we can do that, we'll be successful. So this slide just generally gives the context of some of the things that Harmony and I are going to touch on today.
So just to put this a bit into context, this is a water smart study, so it's co-funded by the federal government, Bureau of Reclamation, as well as state funds, our Water Supply Development Fund. And this is the third basin study that we've done in the state of Oregon. There's been one in the Klamath Basin, one in the Hood River Basin, and now in the Deschutes Basin. And all of them have looked a little bit different, and department involvement has been different. And it's just good to kind of understand that context. We've really, I think, worked through this past processes in this process to build a stronger relationship with Department of Reclamation. And their Water Smart funding is actually a really good fit with the type of planning that we're trying to do in Oregon. The Upper Deschutes Basin study really follows the key planning principles that we discussed earlier of the place-based planning program. They have a balanced representation of interests. It's done in consultation with the state. They're trying to balance in-stream and out-of-stream needs, looking at developing, facilitating local solutions. So it's important to know that the kind of foundations of that are really consistent with the planning principles of our other programs. But it is a different funding mechanism, and they are building on 20-plus years of collaboration and have really generated a lot of interest and brought a lot of resources to the basin to tackle these complex issues.
So it's a little bit of a background, and it's kind of hard to believe, but I've been working in the Deschutes Basin since 1990. And so I've seen a lot of things go on, and have a bit of a historical perspective on collaboration, planning, and other things. Some of the things that I'd also like to mention is that the Deschutes River Conservancy, I happen to be a board member of that entity, and really the DRC has literally pioneered a lot of the techniques for stream flow restoration and has done a lot of work in the basin, worked at almost every principal study, every principal issue that needs to be dealt with in the basin from a stakeholder standpoint. The DRC has been there. Also, we've done other studies, the Deschutes Watershed Planning Initiative. It was to look at the upper Deschutes River below Wickiup and look at how we can restore stream flows in that reach because of the issues that are there. The Deschutes Water Alliance did numerous studies where a whole bunch of work was done to produce about 5 white papers that really delved into all the issues that are in the basin, from stream flow restoration to water supply to reservoir management and other very big comprehensive issues. And so all of those studies have dealt with almost specific topics, issues at hand. The one remaining thing that has been perplexing us since I've been there is that getting higher flows in the upper Deschutes River is very complex, and it deals with multiple irrigation districts, multiple reservoirs, and it's just really a tough issue, and we've never really been able to solve that. And with the basin study, we've got information that helped us look at how we can actually get there. And the other folks that are coming up here are going to talk in much greater detail about it. But anyway, it's an exciting product of this study that's been a multi-year study that's just wrapping up. All right. So, yeah, there we go. So this slide is not for you to digest and understand exactly what's going on, but this is just a illustration of the model that was developed for part of our planning study. It's really the heart of the study. You can see on the left-hand side of this yellow area are all the inputs into the model, and then the outputs. But the model that was developed is a water planning scenario model, and it I've seen models that kind of worked in the basin, but this one really, the Bureau of Reclamation, and I also have to mention that Jonathan LaMarche, he's a hydrologist in my office. The guy is extraordinary at understanding hydrology and how a model works, and you put those two together, and he's a remarkable person. So I do have to compliment him on the work that he put into this. It's very detailed and very complex, but the point of the model is that it was able to illustrate where water shortages show up And then if you make alterations in your flow regime, what effects are on other users of the system. So it works really well. The Deschutes is a very complex river system, and I've seen models that didn't work so well, but this one confidently can say that it really worked well, and it really gave illustrative results of what are the effects when you do changes in the basin. Oh, yes. And so when you work in the Deschutes Basin, there's a lot of interest. And, if you get a few people showing up in any other basin, you're doing pretty well. Well, in the Deschutes Basin, the governing entity that worked on the basin study included 36-plus stakeholders. And so we had a large group at every meeting. And the governance structure for that was that it was nearly consensus-based. We had a card system where it was green cards for yes, yellow cards if you're okay, and then red cards for no. And luckily, we only had maybe a couple times where we didn't get full consensus. But, over 3 years and 36 different individuals speaks volumes to the tenacity and the focus that the Deschutes Basin stakeholders can get together and solve issues. One of the other things I do need to mention that when you have a large entity like that, you also need another smaller subgroup to keep the direction moving. So the department and others, the DRC and others were, in irrigation districts, were key on an entity called the planning team. So we developed agendas, kept the topics at hand, and kept the study moving along. So that planning team was really key in helping focus everybody else in the study. So I think that's it for that one. Yep.
So we kind of approached the department role similarly to how we're thinking about it for place-based planning in terms of all the different types of support that we can provide. But the roles played by different divisions was different from this because field services really took a leadership role in terms of they've Kyle and others have been involved in these collaborative processes for a long time. And so I think in this particular effort, Salem was really there for the assist. And it really started, I think, through the grant-making process, working with our Administrative Services Division to try to bring clarity around some of the funding issues, because we hadn't used our Water Supply Development Fund for planning purposes before. And so we just had some issues to troubleshoot. And so that's kind of where I entered the process. And then it became apparent that we could also bring some technical resources to the project in the other divisions to provide support to Kyle and his staff. And so, the director's office, we really just kind of helped to coordinate support and involvement from the other divisions. Field services, again, really took the leadership role in this effort and was there every step of the way as a planning partner and also providing significant technical assistance to the project. And then these other technical services division and water rights services division really played more of a role in terms of reviewing documents, reviewing inputs, and in some instances contributing on working groups. But it is a little bit different than our place-based planning places, but not significantly so. So in terms of financial assistance, it was $750,000 from our Water Supply Development Fund, and what that went towards was a number of technical memos, which either kind of explored different inputs to the model, looked more deeply at objectives or tools and scenarios that we could bring to bear on the basin study. So a lot of technical work was supported by this grant. Also planning and coordination. DRC played a really significant role in making sure the process was coordinated, as did Watershed Professionals Network, who coordinated the technical work. And this, again, 3 years, 36 partners. The coordination required for this effort has been huge. And then also some support for outreach to the community. In terms of planning, being a planning partner, and Kyle kind of touched on this, you've got the larger steering committee with 36-plus partners. You've got this smaller group of the planning team, which we joined in 2016. And then you have all these different technical working groups that produced different products that fed into the model or fed into the different pieces of the puzzle. And I mean, these were, I think, the BISWIG, as they call it, as we call it, had regular meetings. Planning team was, once or twice a month. Working groups was as needed. And so that's a significant contribution by the department. And then in terms of technical assistance, Kyle mentioned Jonathan LaMarche, who, I was talking to him the other day, trying to wrap my head around the level of assistance that he's provided over the past 2 years. He's saying, 3 to 4 days a month contributing to the models, basically looking at the inputs, helping with calibration, troubleshooting issues. And I think it's important to note that this is not anything that we anticipated providing at the onset. We didn't receive any additional support from the legislature to support the project. This is, again, all work that we are doing on top of our already full workload. But it's testament to the importance of this project that everyone has, when needed, contributed, because we see the significant investment that's being made. We see the importance of these issues. And I've been working to kind of track how we've been involved, and over the past 3 years, we've, as a department, have contributed to over 2,000 hours to this effort, and that's a conservative estimate. I know, right? And as part of tracking our time, like what we're contributing to this, I think it's important for us to, be thinking about, as we think about planning at the state level and contributing as partners to these planning efforts, what does that look like? What is the investment that we're making, both in terms of supporting these processes financially, also the time that we're spending. But we've also been trying to solicit feedback from the partners that we work with, try to get a better sense of where are we doing well, where can we improve. This is a quote from our partner, Mike Ralph, with the Bureau of Reclamation, who could not be here today. But Reclamation, I want to take this opportunity to just say they've been really exceptional partners in this process. They've engaged us heavily. They've taken our feedback. They've solicited and taken our feedback very seriously. There have been a couple, points in the process where, and one example Jonathan LaMarche would bring up, they were using a model that wasn't really a good fit for the basin, and we advocated for use of a newly developed or recalibrated model from the USGS. They didn't have to listen to us, but they did. That posed its own set of challenges, but I think every step of the way they've been willing to engage us on really tough topics. And we've been really grateful for the fact that they've taken our input very seriously. I have a really long list of things to say about this. Oh, that's the next slide. So the lessons learned, and again, this is kind of like we've been trying to solicit some of this feedback. It's really important for the department to be able to provide some technical information up front. We have a lot of the information that is needed for these types of planning efforts. Unfortunately, we don't receive the funding and the staff to be able to deliver that, so that kind of puts us in a reactive mode where we're reviewing, things that are produced, and we don't get to be as involved in maybe providing some of that input. So there's value, but I think that's also been a challenge for the process and a challenge for us, our involvement in the process. Another kind of opportunity and challenge is the development of all these models. We've got, the riverware model, which is the water distribution model. We've got multiple hydrologic models. And they've been developed for the purpose of this study, and they're going to be used for other basin efforts, but there's really a question about how do we sustain these over the long term to support planning efforts. Field services, again, it's been really interesting being involved in this process as well as the other place-based planning, and just looking at the different roles that the different divisions play in each of those efforts. I think, field services leadership in this effort has been really exceptional, and I think Salem staff's involvement would have been much more challenging without field services leadership. And just the difficulty, I mean, of meeting the needs of a huge study like this without additional resources. I know that you're probably getting tired of hearing that. But we do have limited capacity to support things like this. And as we kind of start to try to tackle these complex issues more holistically, thinking about how we provide holistic support to those efforts is an important, outstanding question.
So with all that, 3 years and $1.5 million, we have a whole bunch of information that folks can use to make decisions about how we're going to implement projects, conservation measures, changes in flow regimes. So that's one of the products. And I can't emphasize enough how much information that was put together and assembled and clearly and well done in this study, and hopefully you'll get to hear about that. One of the other things that we developed in this time being was that, you know, not everybody sees things the same way, and by working together over this time, I think we've built some real good relationships with some of the folks in the basin. There were some newcomers to the Deschutes, and you know, they had an interest in the upper Deschutes and its flow regime, and over time I think they became very well versed in how agriculture works and what it needs, and we've coined the term the three fishermen. So there are three folks that have a fishing interest at heart, but yet they came to the study and learned a lot about irrigation. So things like that, you know, that are the intangible things that come out of a study like this are great to see. There's also a coordination that Harmony mentioned between Reclamation and OWRD and others. One of the things that we did, we had 3 outreach meetings, and we had over 150 people attend those 3 outreach meetings. So it really was well received by the basin, and there's a great interest in what we've found and discovered and presented to folks. So you know, I think we were successful there, and this tool that we have now, we can use it in other areas for problem solving. So it's a tool that can be used in other studies or problems that may come up that we need some kind of analytical tool. So with that, you know, we're poised to march on.
I would also say, as in contrast to some of the other planning areas, like this is a really sophisticated approach to planning. You know, we're bringing in some high-powered technical resources to this planning, and I think some groups really imagine, other groups around the state imagine that they would have this expertise and models and things like that. And so I think that's something the other groups look towards as something to kind of aspire to. And then they have to be reminded that the Deschutes has been working at this for a long time.
And there's one more thing I wanted to mention.
So, this Water Smart grants, you say you've done that in 2 basins now. Is that something you can continue to do, and can that be folded into maybe the next phase of place-based planning groups to get maybe another basin or 2 working towards the same goals of what we heard this morning?
It's a competitive funding program at the federal level. So, you know, basins would compete, you know, nationally for that funding. And it's certainly, I think, a model that can and should be used by places going forward. And I would hope that we at the state, you know, level would be coordinated with the basins, that we could think about how we provide that support, you know. But it's definitely, I think, a valuable funding mechanism and a source for great technical resources.
Having worked with both of them, do you think the local input and dynamics that we saw this morning are similar in those type of programs, or is it totally different? Do you think the long-term solutions coming out of those are as effective as what we're seeing with the place-based planning potentially?
I think it's dependent on the place. I think Deschutes, they have such strong, you know, a strong history of collaboration and strong local leadership that they And Reclamation has been very responsive, that they said they wanted to create this really collaborative, open process. And, you know, there's nothing in, I think, Reclamation's rules saying it has to look like it does in the Deschutes, but because of the people there and what they wanted the process to look like, and having a responsive project manager at Reclamation, they were able to kind of shape and mold the process to fit the basin's needs. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that it would look that way, but I think it very much has in the Deschutes, just in my opinion. But it would be a great question to ask the folks that come up after us. Yeah, wrapping up.
All right. So just to recap, there was a huge investment by the state and Reclamation, and I think that investment has yielded great dividends, and we have many tools and a way to analyze changes in the Deschutes that will be coming. There's a huge shift in how the water's managed in the basin. Those will be changing over time, and they are very significant. And I think that the study has laid the groundwork for us to analyze those effects. And then we're supposed to invite Director Byler to share his thoughts and perspective on the department's support of the study.
Well, I've kind of already given you a little bit of my thoughts at the beginning, and I don't know if I have much more to add other than this is an important tool. This is, again, a reflection of the collaborative efforts that we've been seeing for a long time in the Deschutes, and we hope will continue.
All right. So now I'm going to remain, Harmony's going to take a break, and I'm inviting up the partners, and they'll go into more detail about the study.
I'm good. Yeah. Did you want to introduce us, or should
I'd be happy to introduce the panel here. So on my left is Greg Garnett. He's the regional field office manager for Reclamation. Kate Fitzpatrick, program director with the DRC. Adam Sussman, GSI Solutions. Todd Heisler, he's the executive director of the DRC, and he also has short-timers disease like some others. And Craig Harrell is the manager of the Central Oregon Irrigation District.
Okay, thank you. I'm Kate Fitzpatrick with the DRC, but I'm here really as the process coordinator for the Basin study. So the way that we decided to do this for you today, so it wasn't too choppy, is I'm going to give you the overview of the basin, the issues, what we studied, and then I'm going to let the foundation of our study was to meet water needs for, we call it the three legs of the stool, so in-stream needs, irrigated agriculture, as well as growing cities. So we're going to have those perspectives chime in, really take a deep dive on the takeaways on how, from their point of view, this study is going to move us forward in those ways. First of all, Chair Reeves and Commissioners, we want to thank you for having us here. We're pretty excited about what we've been doing for the last 3+ years and to share it with you. Today, the state support, as Harmony and Kyle mentioned, has been critical, both from the monetary perspective as well as from the staff time. Both Kyle and others, as far as field services and being an active part of the planning team, as well as the technical input that the department gave on many different memos. Both Jonathan but others in the department chiming in with hydrologic information and water rights information that has made all of our products a lot stronger. So we really appreciate that. And I'm just going to start to give you a sense here of what we're looking at and hopefully how it relates to the state and to this commission as you move forward in the future. So it's not a unique story in the Deschutes per se. Just at the highest level, we're dealing with issues that many communities, especially east of the Cascades, deal with. We have rivers and streams that are over-appropriated, dating back to the turn of the century. We have junior water rights holders that need more reliable water. Maybe a unique thing in the Deschutes is we have 8 irrigation districts and The senior irrigation districts currently don't have issues meeting their water supply needs, but the junior irrigation district, particularly North Unit Irrigation District, who are the most sort of economically productive district, does have difficulty with reliability. The cities, we have growing cities in Bend and Redmond and other areas, and we have concerns about how we're going to supply them with water. And then, of course, climate change, as everywhere, is going to add to the pressures. So I'm not going to talk at length here because Kyle and Harmony talked about the history of the Deschutes, but I will hit on a few points. We have had a long history of collaboration. In 1996, the tribes, the irrigation interests, and the environmental interests formed the DRC specifically to get ahead of a water conflict and work collaboratively together. I think it's important that the irrigation districts formed an organization called the Deschutes Basin Board of Control to allow them to coordinate together instead of always competing, which has been very powerful and helpful. The Deschutes Water Alliance got together and brought in more local governments in an effort to move towards a regional water management plan. Kyle mentioned the Deschutes Water Planning Initiative, and now the Basin Study Work Group was formed. On the bottom are some of the outputs of these efforts that included planning studies that were generated, as well as in 2007 to 2009, we had an operating water bank in the basin that was very unique and helped move water around. And now we're looking at sort of the completion of the Upper Deschutes Basin Study, and we're moving forward towards more implementation. I think it's really important to note that throughout all this planning, we haven't just been planning, we've actually been doing a lot of work together as partners. That's not exactly how that was supposed to go. So here's just a couple of pictures of when streams were a lot drier, and you can just in the blink of an eye see how restored those streams are. But the point is, those were examples of White Shoes Creek and the Middle Deschutes, where we've, together with our irrigation district partners and other partners, made a lot of progress restoring stream flow while creating win-win solutions for agriculture. We have not solved all the problems, and so I'm going to hit on an overview of what our key issues are now in the basin, and I'm actually going to have a slide for each of these, but Upper Deschutes River flow restoration is a major issue right now I'll go into. That's creating a sort of a more urgency to protect agricultural interests that are at risk from some of the stream flow restoration changes that will be happening. Of course, we have existing legacy stream flow issues in many reaches, and again, this water supply need for growing cities. So Adam suggested I actually do tackle this slide because having you all understand the foundation of how the water works in the Deschutes will help you understand the solutions we're looking at and some of the uniqueness of the sort of policy needs we might have in the future. This is a reclamation we call teacup diagram, and those teacups are the reservoirs. We're going to focus really on this reservoir, which is Wickiup Reservoir. Here's the city of Bend down here. So the stretch between Wickiup and the city of Bend is what we call the Upper Deschutes. Wickiup Reservoir, all of the water in that reservoir is owned for irrigation use, or the rights to it are owned for irrigation use by North Unit Irrigation District that I mentioned, which is Jefferson County, Madras, Culver, that diverse agricultural community. They have the most junior water right in the Deschutes Basin. So there's this irony of the most productive farmers in general having the worst water right, which is why they rely almost wholly on Wickiup Reservoir for their irrigation needs. So then the other irony there is the management of that reservoir to store and release water for irrigation is the major stream flow limiting factor in the Upper Deschutes. It creates low flows in the winter and too high of flows in the summer that have really devastated habitat for red band trout, Oregon spotted frog, and actually has unraveled the ecosystem of that whole stretch of river. These issues have come to a head, at least politically, with the listing of the Oregon spotted frog under the Endangered Species Act. So the need to solve this problem has really accelerated, and the district commitment and interest in solving this problem, the irrigation districts are currently trying to do a habitat conservation plan under the Endangered Species Act with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries to get an incidental take permit so they can continue their operations and not be at risk for, do enough conservation measures so that they can continue and not have that risk under the ESA. And Craig can talk more about that when we get to him. So that's really the priority issue that we looked at in the study, but we also looked at, and this just goes to the point that when we restore flows in the upper Deschutes, which we expect to happen under the Habitat Conservation Plan, that puts North Unit specifically at risk. So what we also know is that some of the other irrigation districts and COID, Central Oregon Irrigation District, that Craig represents down the table, is a senior water right holder, and there are opportunities in that district to generate water, to move to North Unit, to reduce their reliance on the reservoir and restore flows. So we know that there's risk for agriculture that's increasing, but we also know that that necessitates moving water around. So this is a lot of what we looked at in the Basin study. Just a list of other creeks in the basin that still have stream flow issues that we need to work on. And I should mention that we looked at a variety of in-stream flow needs in the basin study. We looked at state in-stream water rates that are currently not met, and we also looked at higher ecological flows in some reaches that we know might be necessary to meet temperature standards or to meet needs for species like the Oregon spotted frog. We also looked at state scenic waterway flows that are higher in some cases than in-stream water rates. Municipal demand, it's hard for me not to hand it over to Adam on this one, but I'll take a shot at it. What we're trying to show you here is the scale of demands in the Deschutes Basin. So on the far right column, the 724,000 acre feet is your average diversion for irrigated agriculture. And then if you look at the far left, the blue, the 40,000 is what is currently being diverted for use by the cities. I should say that's actually groundwater use with associated mitigation credits in acre feet. So 40,000 acre feet, we call it 2% for the cities. It's a very small percentage of water that the cities use. But because we have a Deschutes groundwater mitigation program, which I'm going to assume you're somewhat familiar with as you're reviewing in the next agenda item, we know that to be able to pump more groundwater for growing cities, we need to secure mitigation credits, which historically has involved retiring water rights, surface water rights in stream. So it's not so seamless. It's not the easiest thing to do. The Basin study updated the projections for municipal needs into the future over the next 20 and 50 years, and that's the column right here. And the projected demand over 50 years is 16,000 acre feet. So again, it's a small number when you look at the Basin water budget, but it's not always the most straightforward water to secure. And then this number here is the 130,000 acre feet is on an average water year. If you're just trying to meet the state and stream water rates, how much water you're short. So this kind of helped to provide a scale of what kind of solutions we needed to come up with in the Deschutes. So we understood here that if you look at all the needs in the basin, the median shortages are 130,000 acre feet to meet in-stream water rights, ranging up to 300,000 in dry years. And then if we're looking at higher flows, I talked about higher flows to meet needs for the frog and other reasons. You're looking at ramping up to 200,000 to even 400,000 acre feet in dry years. I did just tell you we have 16,000 acre feet of mitigation, quote, shortage, but that is actually kind of part and parcel of the in-stream number, because when you put water in stream, you create opportunities to generate mitigation. So they are complementary when you can get that right. Did I get that right, Adam? Okay. That's good. So I've mentioned this already, but just to reiterate, the big play in the Deschutes, and you're going to hear about this a lot because it's tricky from a traditional water rights perspective, is to generate water in COID, move water north to North Unit Irrigation District to increase the reliability. That reduces demand on Wickiup Reservoir, allows flows to be restored, and as part of that, we assume that there's we know and we need to develop maybe additional ways to generate some mitigation along the way for cities. So that's the movement that we are pushing for and we are exploring. This really framed our study approach in the Basin study. So to really boil it down to simply, what we did is we evaluated tools to generate water, and I'll talk about those. We evaluated ways to move this water around. We combined these into different scenarios. we put those into that riverware model that we've been talking about, and that allowed us to evaluate how well these actions and scenarios met our water supply goals. This is just a list of that 36-member crew that we would convene every month to actually manage the study. A very diverse set of partners. And yeah.
Can you pause on that slide?
Oh, yeah, sure. Mhm. Just gonna move your microphone back just a little bit because we're gonna get feedback. Okay, that should be better. Okay, so we studied a lot of things. I'm going to boil it down to the 3 major water supply tools. These were water conservation, infrastructure, market-based approaches, and storage concepts. I'll spend a minute or 2 on each of these. Water conservation, generally actions that increase efficiency of irrigation water. So we looked at 3 main ways: piping main canals of irrigation districts. Irrigation districts in Central Oregon were built on volcanic basalt that's very leaky, up to 50% loss in those canals. So if you can save that water through piping, and traditionally we've used the conserved water statute to allocate that water and protect it in stream or increase reliability for irrigation district water users. Piping private laterals is the same mechanism, but it's a beyond the head gate, so a private action versus a district action. And on-farm infrastructure, again, would be a farmer working on their system to conserve water. And you can see that the total opportunity in the Deschutes is significant, 200,000 acre feet. The cost of those projects varies within and between districts. You can see private laterals are fairly affordable. District-owned canals get more expensive. And actually it is a fairly expensive option, but it's also a permanent option, and it's an option that improves operations and management for irrigation districts. And, you know, in some ways it's very simple because it doesn't necessitate large-scale behavioral or cultural change, because you're just making a delivery system better. Some of the barriers to this tool, we've probably all seen newspaper articles of neighbors that oppose having their open canal piped because they've had a water feature in their backyard. So that's something that the districts constantly work through. And again, the cost is just it's an expensive tool. But luckily, I'll have Craig talk later about the opportunities we have right now and the districts have to access significant funding for that tool. And just to bolster optimism, we've been using this tool in the Deschutes over the last 20 years and have significant in-stream results from water conservation in many of the reaches. So we know how to do this. Market-based solutions were the second major water supply strategy we looked at, and this is really just using markets or price incentives to change water use behavior. So we looked at the temporary lease of water rights, and that could be either to the river or from farmer to farmer. We looked at ways to incentivize voluntary duty reduction. For example, if you had a tiered pricing system per acre foot, would some people use less water? And we looked at permanent water transfers. Specifically, this would be more in the urbanizing areas of our basin where water is getting developed anyway, where you could permanently move that in-stream or from farm to farm again. And again, this is almost equally significant as an opportunity as conservation. You can see that it's a much more cost-effective opportunity, but it has its own set of barriers. First of all, you'd have to work with many, many water users to do this at scale. We already are, but we would be wanting to scale it up even more. We also know that irrigation districts have carry water issues. If they lease, for example, too much water off of a certain lateral, they may have delivery issues. So we have to think really strategically about how to optimize this tool. And we think it goes actually really well alongside piping, where those issues wouldn't be in play anymore. Voluntary duty reduction, I think, is a great opportunity in the Deschutes, but this is something that needs some policy analysis. For example, you currently can't lease a portion of a duty. You have to fallow an entire acre. This is these tools we've been using in the Deschutes, again, already over time. So we know how to do a lot of this already to great effect. The third major category we looked at was storage, and I want to be really clear that these storage concepts were really focused on in-stream flow outcomes, and they were not looking at new storage. It was looking at relocating storage from Wickiup Reservoir closer to North Unit, who are the users of storage. So a more efficient way to store water. And then a little piece in the Crooked River where we looked at recovering some storage lost to sedimentation. We know there's a lot of barriers to large new off-channel storage projects. They're not easy, they're not quick, but they potentially could be a wonderful tool in the Deschutes. And this is just a map showing where those concepts were looked at. So when you put all these together, this is the summary of the tools we looked at. You can see a wide range of costs, but a significant opportunity. And then what did we do? We put these together in combination, moved them around, moved the water that we generated around in different ways. It's really important that these are hypothetical assumed actions. We're saying if we could actually capitalize on the whole opportunity, this is what we could do. And in all cases, this involves significant reduction in the irrigation demands, largely in Craig's district, and it involves, frankly, a lot of money. On the high side, what we learned is if we can do these things, we actually met most in-stream and out-of-stream needs in most years. We also learned that when we can integrate conservation and water marketing, for example, we get more cost-effective and more quickly implementable solutions. So the bottom line is we have the solutions we need to solve the problems in the Deschutes, and it will require both financial and cultural commitment. Just one more slide to give you a sense of the scenario inputs. The different colors are those three different tools I talked about. Well, one exception is that the green is water marketing, the dark green, and then the light green is water marketing in a dry year. We didn't want to oversolve the problem, so we thought it would be really cool to have dry year actions that would be kind of leasing in dry years on top of a permanent base of water to respond to the hydrologic year. You can see we tried to do a more cost-effective scenario that was kind of heavy on the water marketing, and then we added infrastructure as we moved through the scenarios. We also, those two different levels, scenarios 1 and 2 tried to meet in-stream water rights, and scenarios 3 and 4 tried to meet higher ecological flows. So at the cheaper end, we've got just around $100 million to try to meet in-stream water rights, and we were successful. And then at the far end, we kind of put everything in the toolbox in there at a sort of shocking price of $1.1 billion and a new reservoir, and we solved all the problems. It's important to acknowledge, too, that embedded in these scenarios are opportunities to generate groundwater mitigation. Some of these are proven pathways, like in-stream transfers, and some of these are more creative solutions that probably need a little more analysis and evaluation. So I'm going to hand it over now to my colleagues here to talk about, so what are the major takeaways from the study? Commissioner? Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't mention, this is the water supply inputs, that pretty much how we moved water is whatever was generated, we moved to North Unit, and then we had flow restoration in the upper Deschutes, and this is just talking for the Deschutes Basin. And we sent 10% of the water supply solutions to the middle Deschutes, so probably too much detail, but that movement of water I talked about, that big play, is embedded in how we modeled the scenarios.
Oops, no.
Oops, sorry.
Can you go back?
Yes.
2 more slides.
2 more
I think.
slides.
And so, that was a great presentation. It's very impressive, but I'm not sure I captured it all. So, one thing you could help me with is, I'm coming with the impression that there's water there to solve most of the problems if we can figure out how to manage it. Is that correct?
That is correct, and there's some money involved as well.
And so then when I was looking at, that's good news, by the way. When I was looking at the costs, either of water conservation or storage, those seem like pretty high costs per acre foot, $5,000 per acre foot. When you're talking about the total cost to meet the needs, how far do we dip into that water conservation infrastructure at $5,000 an acre foot are we doing? Do we have to do all of that?
You know, in a perfect world, we would be able to implement all of these. You know, we have water law. I was here in front of you about a year ago. I think it was Kathy's first commission meeting, and I can't remember who else was brand new, but it was me coming to set the stage for these changes that have to be done with water law or through different ways of moving water, and those are the cheap solutions. You know, we can put numbers to everything, and we can engineer everything to a perfect world, but you still have water law to deal with. You still have patrons to deal with, which are in themselves. I can get sued from either side, no matter what I do. The pendulum can go one way too far and get sued by my own patrons, or I can get sued by environmental groups. So I'm trying to push this fine line of what can we do financially at COID to meet the needs of our basin, and that goes to a lot of these other programs that we're going to kind of hit on as we go through this presentation. But we know how to balance our basin. That's really what it came down to. The basin study really was a study of studies over the last 10 to 12 years to really assure us we know how to do these projects and these jobs. We know they all have a funding mechanism that's there or not there. We have federal funding that we are getting right now to start some large projects. With that federal funding, though, is the ask of the department. We need some flexibility on how we move water within the basin. So if we can get that flexibility, I think the costs will go down on a lot of these. But the flexibility is a challenge because in our basin it works great. In another basin in Oregon it may not work great. So we have to be really careful. I don't know if I answered your question. So where we're at is if we hadn't have done this basin study, the Deschutes Basin Board of Control was an applicant with the DRC to bring this money forward through the Water Smart program, and that's how it came to be, and we worked with the state of Oregon as well. So with that, we got the 36, I always say 37, but we have 36 to 37 stakeholders, and you saw that list. We were able to go and secure large funding to our basin through federal funds through the PL 566, which is being administered through the NRCS. And where we're at is the districts in the Deschutes Basin are doing watershed plans to show that we're going to do conserved water projects in our districts for the benefit of the river and for the benefit of others, whether it's the municipalities, the river, or the districts themselves to share. So that's what's come out of this is I don't think we would be as far as we are with getting this federal funding if we hadn't have done this project. So that's why I was here a year ago in front of you, because it's kind of chicken and egg. We're finishing up the basin study at the same time that we're asking for federal funding. And I believe that the pathways are becoming really clear on what is the path of least resistance, I guess, is what I'm following. We're following the money, and we're following the path of least resistance. What can we do within the ORSs to move water? So as Kate mentioned, COID being one of the largest, most senior districts that has a lot of water to be mined through conservation, moving that appropriately for the benefit of the river at the same time of helping our junior water user. We believe we know how to do that. We've worked with the department. That was the ask the last time I was in front of you, and I think that we have made significant progress in the year on that. And we're going to be starting to share those publicly now as we move forward in the next month or two. So excited about that.
Can I ask one question about assumptions? Throughout this, I couldn't tell. Echo both of Bob's comments. Wonderful, rich. Boy, there's a lot to track. What's the assumption around agriculture and the footprint and its, therefore, demand over the next 50 years?
Yeah, great question, Commissioner Mall. Agriculture, there's no new acres that are planned to be under production.
What about reduction of acres over time?
I would say, I'll answer that. I'm going to answer that one, not you. So yes, I mean, COID is an urbanized district. We have the city of Redmond and the city of Bend. I think 10 to 20 years ago, we were 46,000 acres. We're 42,000 acres. So over time, we're reducing. What we do believe is that our hope is to be able to deliver water to our partner North Unit and not be hurt financially, and our acres will reduce. In no way will these conservation projects expand our district boundaries. That is not what we're doing at all.
I'm just thinking more from a water budget standpoint. For example, the Willamette 2100 projects a net decline in agricultural land and therefore more efficient use in urban settings, and so it takes some of the pressure off the water budget, is the assumption that's in there. I'm curious if
The assumption that's
similar.
in the Basin study, I'm not saying this is going to happen.
Of course.
That's in the scenarios, I think was 5,000 acres of urbanized land would be followed. Now, I think the way that water would move would go COID, North Unit, Upper Deschutes.
Or
So-
City of Bend, or City of
Bend, yeah.
Redmond.
So by and large, agriculture would stay the same, but I think any given year, you would have more agricultural land being leased to other uses or users.
Yeah, COID is planning to have total acreage in the next 20 years of 37 to 38,000 acre feet, and we're at 42,000 now. So we're planning for the reduction. And yes, Adam can talk to a little bit, but we have this argument with cities right now. We do supply a lot of athletic fields and school fields with our irrigation district water, and it would be nice to switch eventually over to a more, I guess, more conservation-minded way of delivering water.
You mean like gray water on parks? What do you mean?
No, it's river water. It's water from the river on parks. So Drake Park.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by switch over to a more?
To city-treated water. It would be a more expensive water delivered, but it would be delivered efficiently.
Thank you.
Cost also demands a higher efficiency of use.
Thank you.
So the other big takeaway here, and it's really kind of, you struck at the heart of it, Bob, with your question, is you can't just look at those three tools, conservation, water marketing, and storage, and say, well, this one's cheapest, so I shouldn't do any of that really expensive stuff. I should just do all of that. Because what we learned in the study, given all the barriers, both policy, cultural, and others, and physical, is that the takeaway here is you've got to integrate them on the ground. So piping canals opens up opportunities to lease water and transfer water more creatively than you could if you had just a completely open system that's losing 30-40% of its water leaking into the ground. So the takeaway is, you just can't grab the list and say, I go to that, let's do all of that. You have to be strategic, and you have to integrate them. And so both programs, and they're really different programs. One is major infrastructure, and one is banking. One is marketing, incentive. It's working with patrons. It's working with different kinds of policies. It's ultimately working with water law differently. So both of them, what Craig's saying is absolutely right. The working with the conserved water, how we can flexibly use that and move that is a challenge, given the way the statute works. As we're seeing the appurtenancy of water rights and transfer statutes, those are also challenging when your objective is to move literally tens of thousands, 100,000 acre feet of water from one part of the basin to another, to our agricultural sector, in trade for storage at the very top of the system. So this is massive, and so I think the takeaway is you're going to hear from us again. We're going to be back, and we're going to be working together to figure out this right package and some of probably the policy tweaks that are going to be necessary to make this really work. So integrating the two on the ground is critical. What was my other one? Yeah, and pretty much already said that. The key, as I talk about, we have to create the superhighway that moves water from COID to North Unit into the upper Deschutes. And it's got to be a superhighway because it's got to be at scale. This is not just a one-off project. This is moving lots and lots and lots of water over the next 2 decades. So we've got to perfect the legal framework and, the legal pathway. That's one of the very first things to do it. Do our pilot projects, figure out how we do it, and then just do it over and over again at scale. So that's another real takeaway that we learned from the study.
Sorry, can I ask a newbie vocabulary question? I assume I know what a patron means, but I've never heard that term used before, natural resources.
Customer.
A customer.
Yeah, that's the farmer's way of saying customer.
A customer. You say that? You say patron? Yep.
And specifically of an irrigation district.
Irrigation district customer.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's been a long time since I was introduced, so I'm Adam Sussman with GSI Water Solutions, and I'm here to talk to you about the 2%ers, right? The municipal water user leg of this tool. But before I get going on my notes here, I just wanted to tell you that, because no one really said this, that the glue of this entire project is sitting right next to me on my left, Kate. So no one has said that. Kate has been keeping us all in line, organized, and focused for more than 3 years. Thank you for doing that, because it's been an amazing job. Tons of information. I've heard you all say, wow, this is really hard to absorb. But what I'm going to tell you is going to be really easy to absorb, okay? So here we go. So we talked about that there's a mitigation program in the Deschutes Basin, right? And I don't know if any of you understand the mechanics of how that works. I know Chair Reeves does, because we worked on it together in 2002. But in short, in order to pump more groundwater, you have to do some kind of mitigation. Well, this fairy dust mitigation, the way it occurs is you take an acre of irrigation water right, generally speaking, you take it off someone's water rights certificate, and you put it in stream, okay? That's how it works, and that's how it worked since the program's been initiated since about 2005 is when it really got going. So in 2005, when this program got going, it was a great time to start this program because the economy was absolutely booming. There was a lot of urbanization within Central Oregon Irrigation District especially, and there were water rights coming off the ground, right, because this urbanization was occurring, and they were available for creating mitigation. So it was kind of the perfect storm. We had this new regulatory program, we had a booming economy, and then Kate showed you in 2007, we actually formed what was called the Deschutes Water Alliance Bank, where folks would sit around a table and say, okay, well, these 30 acres came off, how are we going to divvy them up? Okay, Avion Water Company, you get some, DRC, you get some. And it was a great voluntary sort of banking program. That worked really well until something happened. You might remember it's called the Great Recession, right? So when the Great Recession hit, that process, the wheels came off. You notice the bank went from 2007 to 2009. Well, it ended in 2009 for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons was there was no more water rights coming off the ground and available, okay? So all of a sudden, if you're a municipal water provider and you're trying to plan for your future and where these mitigation credits are coming from, it was giving you pause, although they had a lot of other things to worry about during the Great Recession, right? As we came out of the Great Recession, another thing happened that you were told about today, and that is the first we heard a lot of murmurs about the listing of the spotted frog, and then we actually had the spotted frog listed, and folks like North Unit Irrigation District just lost, 30, 40,000 acre feet or more of water supply that they used to have. So the result of all of that is that that easy way of creating mitigation like we were doing back in 2007 through 2009 it doesn't exist anymore. And I know Craig has said there could still be some urbanizing acres becoming available, but I think the districts are trying to figure out, like, well, what do we do with that? What, gee, City of Bend, we think you're important, but we got our friend North Unit Irrigation District over here that we need to think of. So it's a new game, okay, in terms of the mitigation program in the Deschutes Basin. So the Basin study was great and the timing was perfect because we got to do two things. One was we got to really drill in and ask ourselves, what is the demand for this mitigation? Okay, what is the reasonable expectation for this mitigation? And so we did that. We had call a Task 2 memo that GSI worked on. We were partners with the department, and that's the 16,000 acre feet number that Kate was showing you. We also worked on a lot of memos about what are other ways to create mitigation. I mean, is the only way to take Black Acre off of Craig's certificate and put it in stream forever, or are there other things we can do? I mean, we're falling all over ourselves to put water in stream through conserved water and releasing stored water in the winter. There's got to be some way to make that water going in stream for more than one purpose, the other purpose potentially being mitigation, okay? And so I've been in front of you, and I know others have been in front of you, sort of having this conversation more than once. Tom's probably getting tired of hearing my spiel, but we're at this new place. We know we've got this mitigation demand. We're not exactly sure where it's going to come from. We have some ideas, but those discussions are not over. In fact, they haven't even got going very far. And so my pitch to you in terms of a takeaway is we don't have a crisis right now, but we're getting pretty close to one in terms of trying to figure this out. And what we need from you as a policymaking body and a department as a leadership resource agency body, we need some help. We need to work with the districts to figure out, as we're moving water around in these creative ways, what are we going to do to satisfy what we know is a known mitigation demand based on a regulatory program of the departments in the basin. So the takeaway here is we need the best minds, good leadership, maybe money, people, whatever it takes. We need help figuring this out in a collaborative way so that we can all move forward. Thanks.
There are two more points, if that's okay, and takeaways. One is kind of an obvious one, but state support has been really critical to this ongoing collaboration, and we have a group in the Deschutes eager to continue and eventually work towards a plan. We don't really know who should convene this group, so we're kind of at this, when and how are we going to continue to move this towards a plan? Just wanted to put that out there, and continued state partnership on this, I think, will be really important. Additionally, and Harmony and Kyle mentioned this, but the state's ability to have hydrologic modeling capacity, and Jonathan LaMarche has been really critical, continuing to use those models to understand how water management affects us both for climate change, and I think partly to Adam's point, what are the groundwater impacts of, especially if we start moving water around creatively for groundwater mitigation? What does that actually mean so we can have some trade-off analysis? So I know the GS flow model, USGS is working on improving that right now. When they do, it would be great to stay involved with that and whatnot. So that's my technical plug. And that's all that we had. So we are open to more questions.
Questions from commissioners?
Well, I think first there needs to be a presentation. Sounds like your leadership in this.
Appreciate that.
I was getting a little worried.
Thank you.
But there's always a little spice that comes with sweetness to the question. I mean, my head is spinning in part because I'm still new. Don't have the technical background. Think in terms of land use impacts because of the land trust world I come from. And I think I remember some of the dynamic, but from my limited knowledge perspective, you're sitting on gold. You have major change going on in this basin, socioeconomic change. And the crisis, and don't interpret any of this as being my wish or desire. I'm just trying to understand the dynamics. But it seems like if you're moving towards a crisis, the market's going to take care of this because someone is going to buy that gold and move it to where the highest bidder is. But the limitation is legally you can't do that. You're limited by the kind of transfers either from infrastructure or even how we can move water from one area to another. Am I oversimplifying that?
Can I just say one thing?
I'm gonna-
Yeah. Commissioner Mole, because that was a big thought and that could take a really long time to answer. But from the 2%ers perspective, buying the gold, okay, let's just talk about
Right,
that
right,
for a
right.
second because I
Yeah.
wanted to make this point and I forgot to, is that as you have uncertainty about how this mitigation program, and I'm just going to use that as an example, if you have uncertainty about how this mitigation program is going to work and we're all trying to figure it out, that actually provides an opportunity for speculation, okay? And this is happening.
Yeah.
People going around the basin looking for that gold with big bags of money and buying up farmland potentially, and then selling those mitigation credits for lots and lots of money
Yes.
for mitigation. And that has actually happened. The city of La Pine paid, $10,000 in mitigation credit due to, there's a whole set of reasons why they couldn't get mitigation. But so as a policy-making body, that's something for you all to think about is that good public policy to have that kind of stuff going on? The DWA Bank, where people got together and took those acres that were coming off the land and sat around figuring out what to do, that precluded that kind of speculation from happening. And so I think that's a short answer. I'm sure others
Well,
may want to
let
weigh in, but-
me chime in. So my board at this time does not allow the taking off of water to sell for speculation. We are here because we want to be socially responsible. A lot of people may not think that, but we're at the table. We're here because we want to be here. Yes, we could leverage this water to financial gains for sure, but in no way does this basin study say we're doing that. And then the second part is those federal funds, that federal funding and any funding we will get from the state eventually assures that those funds are used appropriately to balance this water. If I'm using funds from the public, it is for the public good. That's why it's going to stay within this.
And if I could just, oh, sorry.
Chair Reeves, members of the commission, I'd just like to chime on a little bit. The thing is that Central Oregon Irrigation District does have a senior right, and they have a massive water right, and then they have a partner named North Unit, who are commercial farmers, and they have the most junior water right. And it could be easy for Central Oregon Irrigation District to just say, yeah, it's not our problem, we'll let you guys take care of it, but they're not doing that. And I think that just speaks volume of the work among irrigation districts in the basin and working together to solve the problem, because it could be easy for Central Oregon Irrigation District just to walk away and keep the money.
Yeah, I think that what you're going to see is what you've recognized, that the pressure to do that is going to get greater and greater from your patron membership. I guess it was helpful to hear, okay, therefore, that's what we're asking of the commission and the department, to help with a distribution of public good, is what it sounds like you're asking for.
And if I could, Chair and Commissioners, just a preview that, I think market-based tools can be incredibly powerful within the right governance and plan framework. And we're currently launching a grant, COID's grant with Reclamation, to develop a water marketing strategy in the basin that I think can put the boundaries and the edges around some of these things. It's a pretty significant 3-year grant that will hopefully provide the roadmap of how we can use markets in a way that discourage speculation and encourage the public outcomes that we want to see.
So I think I want to see whether what I'm thinking is, I heard is what you, what you intended for us to hear. It sounds like the messages are that there is a problem in the basin that needs to be addressed. And there's the study that's given us much better information about how water moves around, basically. And there are ways in which the regs, policies, statutes, everything we have in place doesn't work to legally move water as opposed to how it moves hydrologically, and that the group in the basin will be working on trying to kind of more specifically look at what potential solutions are, and then we'll be and with the department, well, with Kyle and Harmony have been at this for a while, and that eventually there will be conversation with the commission about changes that you will be advocating that the state should be making about this? I mean, is that pretty much, I mean, this felt kind of like a fire hose, but that setting the stage for more to come, basically.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what we're going to see is, we've been discussing with the department, you will see a rulemaking, a rack on something where you're going to have all 36 people on that list from the Deschutes Basin, hopefully supporting that when we come to the rack for some rule changing. And that's why we did this, is so that we'll all be coming forward with a joint message.
And each of the tools, whether it's infrastructure, which is conserving water and moving the conserved water, or moving water rights, or moving storage, the storage piece, they all have different limitations from a legal and policy standpoint. And we're hoping that we can get, at least I think, the market and the conserved water pieces to play together. But there will still be nuances that you'll need slightly different approaches legally to get both of those to work, to solve the problem, and to support groundwater mitigation in the process.
Yeah, and I would just add, Chair Reeves, that, I hope your takeaway isn't like, we did this great study and we could fix everything if you just change the law, because I think it's way more complicated than that. I think the follow-up includes, the collaborative forum going forward, technical support, funding, leadership, policy leadership, and sort of digging into these issues that we have found. So I don't want to leave you with, that's the total outcome of the study, because there's a lot of things we can do within the law as well.
Right.
But it's a piece of a puzzle of things that we need to do going forward. And we kind of wanted to emphasize that point, because that's the one that's in your wheelhouse, right? So that's why we want to make sure you don't leave this meeting without at least that sticking in your mind, which clearly it has. So. Mission accomplished.
Let me give you a real practical example. COID is going to embark on its first phase of a $40 million project under PL 566. We will start that construction sometime next fall. That's about 40 CFS that we would generate in conserved water. Conserved water for COID, we would put it in at our point of diversion, and that would affect the middle Deschutes. What we're trying to do is move that water to the upper Deschutes, and that's what we've been working with the department on. How can we do this within the rules? So COID is still continuing down the path of this project going forward. We know we can probably do it temporarily, moving it, but getting the permanent solutions, and I'm doing a watershed plan that's going to say, we will move this temporarily until we figure out how to make it permanent. That's what we're talking about. Where it's not stopping anything. We'll do pilot projects, but we will be coming with, hey, we just generated 100 CFS over the last 3 years. We need to make it permanent, or we need to make rules to move it somewhere else. That's the gist of what we're going to see.
Yes, Mike?
Just in your project, for that much money, is likely piping your system? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so COID's first phase, Tumalo Irrigation has done their first phase of piping with PL 566. Swally will be doing some here in the next year, and Central Oregon Irrigation District will be doing main piping, main laterals. But to Todd's point, we're working with the Deschutes River Conservancy on-farm. So we're going to be doing the main piping, but we're also going to be starting to do on-farm programs and looking at opportunities elsewhere as well. There's low-hanging fruit, there's expensive fruit, and there's everything in between.
But then sorry, I'm trying to capture it all myself, but so you're looking at the incentive to pipe, be conservative, and look at the long-term needs of the entire basin and how you can move that water from one section to the other so that everyone walks away with some solution.
Yeah, we believe this federal funding is multifaceted. I believe, just my opinion, the $40 million project that COID is embarking on will help COID deliver water efficiently to make change on farm, get water to North Unit, because we would trade that 40 CFS to North Unit. In turn, they would release 40 CFS in the wintertime from stored water for the ESA-listed species. And then we also have an aspect that we've never really thrown out there, but we know is there. Winter releases from stored water can have mitigation benefit. So if you're spending $40 million, you can help all legs of the stool. And that's what this large funding opportunity really is to generate multiple benefits.
And you're going to have very specific recommendations on rule change? What particular rules are prohibiting you from doing that? You're going to be really specific to that, or we're working with them on that?
I'll let Tom.
Yeah, we're working on that with them, and there's a specific statute in the law today that could, if we do some rulemaking, provide a process for doing permanent in-stream, making some permanent in-stream flows in the upper reaches, and that's what we want to explore. That's what we've been talking about as a longer-term tool. I would just add that what we're hearing from these folks today is something that we are going to be hearing from every basin in the state as we enter an era of redistribution, or whatever you want to call it. It's a kind of a new era that we're dealing with, where it's not just a matter of getting a new water right, it's a matter of figuring out how to put water in the right places at the right time, and that's extremely complex. And I would suspect, as we go down this path with this group, that there are going to be a lot of policy questions that are going to be raised, and but they won't necessarily be policy. The solutions we may come up with may not fit in other basins of the state, and I think that adds another layer of complexity for us as we go down this path. To what extent can we deal with these administratively through rulemaking in the agency, or to what extent are they going to have to be legislative solutions? And then how do we thread that needle if the solutions that one basin is looking for might be a threat in another basin? So there's just adds to the fun.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Bob?
I just wanted to check a presumption. Kate, you had mentioned very quickly that you're looking at climate change. I'm wondering if that means that you're going to be looking at projections of the timing of when water's available, the volume of that water, how you can manage that with your current system or new system as you may propose, and how that influences your suite of options. And maybe you could speak to that, tell me how that's going to work out for you.
Yeah, Chair Reeves and Commissioner Baumgartner. So the study was, climate change was a part of it, and we have climate change projections in the study, but when we were supposed to run climate change analysis on our water management scenarios, and I mentioned the USGS flow model. That worked really well for their original intent of their calibration. It didn't calibrate well for the purposes of our study assessing the climate change impacts of the water management scenarios. I'm looking at Aurora still in the room, if she wants to add to any of that. So hopefully in the future we can, but we know some broad things. We know that all the projections, are looking at 3 degrees C or warmer, and then there's a variation in precipitation. Most of them were at the same or increased precipitation, so that will be a timing of the flows issue. The creeks without reservoirs will have more impact on that timing, but even the main stem Deschutes having reservoirs, there will still be a timing based on that reduced snowpack and associated pressures and groundwater returns from that. I don't know if other people want to chime in, or Aurora, if you have anything to add. No? Okay. But, by and large, we think that all of our strategies are building more resiliency into a system to respond to needs where we can figure out how to adapt when we need to get water in certain places at certain times.
Thank you.
Weigh in on that one really quick.
Yeah.
So this is the one area where USGS was working on the GS flow model. We had this, riverware model. Bureau of Reclamation developed these other models as inputs. And they were developed for different purposes. They're on different timelines, but we were identifying opportunities to bring these tools together. And it wasn't a perfect fit the first time around. No one had kind of anticipated that we would do that or what that might take. But we've identified that as an opportunity and as a need. And the USGS has committed to kind of continue to work with that model to improve its alignment with the other models. But that's where continuing to invest in these tools and sustain them and bring the partners together, and then using them for planning purposes going forward. We just want to make sure that if we make these huge investments in developing tools, that we sustain that and then actually use them. But it's tricky. It's tricky to get all these things aligned, especially when we have these 2 federal agencies. But they are working together, and I think that's really promising. So we hope to improve those climate change projections and incorporate that over time. It's just we weren't quite able to do it this round.
Thank you, Harmon.
Any other questions?
Can I just get one clarification? How many acres of active farmland is in the north unit?
Just about 50,000 acres.
50,000?
50,000 from Deschutes lands, and then another 9,000 from Crooked River.
We didn't talk about that complexity.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I have no doubt that you guys are going to get this done. And please come back when we can weigh in or what be helpful in some way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a break until 3:15. Okay? We'll just do that to start. Okay. Let us resume our meeting. So, this is an update on the Deschutes Basin Groundwater Mitigation Program. An annual review and a 5-year review, right? So, why don't you guys have at it?
Okay, good afternoon, Chair Reeves and members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Dwight French. I'm the Water Rights Services Division Administrator. And this might be the only time I get to talk during the presentation because Sarah has it totally covered. And I just wanted to thank her for developing the report and the presentation. This is her first full year in her new role that was covered for many years so well by Laura Wilkie. And so with that, I'll let you go.
Thank you.
And for the record, my name is Lisa Jaramillo, and I'm the Transfer and Conservation Section Manager.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Reeves and members of the Commission. For the record, I'm Sarah Henderson. I'm the new Flow Restoration Coordinator, and this is for support and help if I need it. Okay, and so I will, I think I can just push it? Okay. All right. I'm going to start out today by giving you some background on the Deschutes Mitigation Program. In 1993, the U.S. Geological Survey initiated the Deschutes Basin groundwater study, and OWRD cooperated with that effort. In 1998, the conclusion showed a direct hydraulic connection between groundwater and surface water within the study area. This meant that groundwater use within the study area had the potential for substantial interference with surface water and would measurably reduce the scenic waterway flows. Because of this direct connection and the fact that no surface water was available for new appropriations, the department was unable to issue any new groundwater permits within the Deschutes groundwater study area. So on September 13, 2002, the Water Resource Commission adopted the Deschutes Basin groundwater mitigation rules in Division 505 and the Deschutes Basin Mitigation Bank and Mitigation Credit Rules in Division 521. The development of this mitigation program created a pathway for new groundwater permits within the Deschutes groundwater study area to be issued with mitigation. The goals of the Deschutes Basin groundwater mitigation rules are, in no particular order, to maintain flows for the scenic waterways and senior water rights, including in-stream water rights, to sustain existing water uses and accommodate growth through new groundwater development, and to facilitate restoration of stream flows in the middle reach of the Deschutes River and related tributaries. The department is required to report annually and every 5 years on the Deschutes mitigation program under Division 505. This year, we have combined these two reports into one. As part of our evaluation, we consult with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Parks and Recreation, Department of Environmental Quality, and Division of State Lands. Annual reporting requirements are listed on the left, and the 5-year Division 505 requirements are listed on the right. There is a lot of reporting associated with this program. In addition to the annual and 5-year administrative evaluation we're presenting today, we're required to provide a legislative report every 5 years. So starting in 2021, the two 5-year reports will be combined for improved efficiency. The mitigation program by rule allows an additional 200 CFS of new groundwater use in the Deschutes groundwater basin, referred to as the allocation cap, or CAP. This pie graph is showing you that there has been 151.04 CFS allocated out of the 200 CFS cap. The amount remaining in the cap is 48.96. At the end of 2017, there were 27 pending applications without a final order, totaling 17.34 CFS. That leaves 31.62 CFS that has not been applied for. As you can see, approximately 5 to 6 new permits were issued each year over the past 5 years. There have been 127 permits issued since the start of the program. 116 of those are active, 11 were canceled. 17 of those permits have an incremental development plan. Incremental development plans are municipal and quasi-municipal users. The mitigation obligation can be obtained incrementally over time as water is developed rather than providing all of it before permit issuance. They must also report to the department annually on the volume of water used and the source of mitigation provided. The blue bar that you see here shows the total use in acre feet allowed by the permits, so that was approved. The green bar shows the acre feet they were allowed to use based on the mitigation that they provided. And the red bar shows the actual amount they pumped or used. So you can see that they're not pumping as much as they're allowed to.
Was that one particular year? Was that-
Excuse me?
I'm sorry, was that one particular year? Is this?
The total use allowed by permits, that's all 17 permits.
Was this like 2017?
Oh, yes.
As of the
Well,
end.
well, use allowed based by, yes, 2000, that's the 1 year, 2017.
2017?
Yes. This slide is showing all established mitigation, both used and unused. The majority of the mitigation that has been provided is permanent. Out of a total of 9,010 acre-feet of mitigation, 6,113.5 is permanent, shown in the orange. Permanent mitigation is mainly created by permanent in-stream transfers, and temporary mitigation is created by in-stream leases and also time-limited in-stream transfers. This slide is showing you what zones the credits are established in. The orange line represents the permanent credits, and the yellow line represents the temporary credits. On this slide, the green line is showing you the amount of credits, both permanent and temporary, that have been created or established. Some credits can be used in multiple zones. The blue line shows how much of the established mitigation that's been allocated or used to fulfill a mitigation obligation. In other words, it's the amount of mitigation that has been linked to a final order or a permit. The difference between the two lines is the amount of established mitigation not yet used or tied to a groundwater final order or permit. Currently, there are two mitigation banks, Deschutes River Conservancy Mitigation Bank, DRCMB, and the Deschutes Irrigation LLC. Banks are required to report on the activity and credit transactions to the department annually. Right now, we have one active mitigation bank, and that is the Deschutes River Conservancy. They report annually and maintain a reserve for all of the temporary mitigation credits that are used in every zone. A key component of the program is to assess whether the established in-stream requirements, meaning the scenic waterway flows and senior in-stream water rights, continue to be met on at least an equivalent or more frequent basis as compared to the representative base period flows. To verify and track this component, the department developed a stream flow model. It was constructed using a 30-year base period from 1966 to 1995. The model is a computer program that estimates the change in stream flows expected due to the approval of mitigation projects and groundwater permits under the mitigation program. It should be noted that the model does not reflect any other stream flow restoration activities in the basin, such as canal piping or lining. The results show that overall in the basin as a whole, the changes are small. However, the department feels that additional evaluation is needed. Here, we will take a closer look at some results of the model data. The left column is showing the gauging stations where data is collected. The middle column shows the percentage of time in-stream flow requirements were met during the baseline period, 1966 to 1995. These are the annual numbers only. The right column shows the change in percentage after the mitigation is put into the model. You can see that in some of the areas there is a slight negative effect. However, they are all less than 1% change. The results of the model for the 2017 time period are shown in detail on the tables in attachment 3 of the report. When looking at the attached tables in the report, you will see that the majority of the negative numbers are in the winter months. This is mainly because the mitigation being put in stream is mostly from irrigation rights that use water during the summer months only. The net effect of the mitigation program on in-stream flows has largely remained minimal compared to the baseline conditions on an annual basis. Comments were received by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Environmental Quality. They're concerned about some of the effects of the program, such as impacts to springs and the effects on stream flows outside of the irrigation season. Last year, we talked about starting a Deschutes work group to evaluate how the program is working. And that work group has been delayed due to staff turnover and not being able to take on anything new during this past year. Additionally, there were broader discussions and studies occurring in the basin, such as the Deschutes Summit and the Upper Deschutes Basin Study. Because of all this, the department decided to delay the work group, but we are still committed to working with our sister agencies and stakeholders to improve the program. And thank you. Do you have questions?
Questions, anyone?
Seems like it's functioning quite well. I've asked this question, I think, several years. We're going to get to the end, and then what? In other words, it's all going to be allocated. Then what's the next step?
Well, that's the $1.1 billion question. So,
Growth and everything going, I mean, it really
well,
is coming.
yeah, we could, it'll be several years at least before the remaining water is doled out and we reach the ceiling of the cap, theoretically. I think our challenge, and it was, alluded to in the previous discussion item, was that there's a lot of interest in the basin and quite a bit of horsepower at seeing if we can, create some alternative solutions for mitigation credits, even before the cap is reached. So, that's the big challenge. One of the little nuggets that I've heard before and that you heard just before the break was there is an interest in releasing some stored water or converting some storage water to in-stream benefits, possibly resulting in some mitigation credits in the wintertime. So not only would that potentially create another big chunk of mitigation, but also help, even out the impacts of what Sarah alluded to, was that a lot of the mitigation has come from irrigation district lands being converted in stream. And so we're not having a lot of much mitigation come from wintertime uses, but the groundwater uses that are occurring generally have a even or annual impact on the river, a slow but steady impact. So that causes some negative effects in the wintertime and some positive effects in the summertime, but the districts are interested in exploring whether or not they can create some mitigation credits in the wintertime, so that looks promising. But still, that doesn't raise the cap, and we got to work with at a minimum ODF and W and DEQ and state parks, and then some broader stakeholders to see kind of what it would take for folks to be comfortable with raising the cap.
So can you go back a couple slides to
Sure.
the lower bridge?
To where?
Right there.
Okay.
Right there.
The big band in the middle.
I think that's it. The Deschutes River lower bridge, maybe .21. When I was looking at the, on page 17 of appendix 3 staff report, I was also looking at lower bridge. And it strikes me that we've got kind of a seasonal pattern that we see, where, especially at lower bridge, we see a lot more flow in the summer, which seems like a good thing. Less flow and a change in percent reduction negative in the winter. And I'm wondering if you can help me as I look through this, what I infer is the role that the mitigation credits have had in these seasonal changes, and how do we weigh higher flows in the winter compared to a different pattern, or higher flows in the summer compared to a reduced flow in the winter?
So I think you had two different questions.
Yeah, there are at least two questions.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not trying to cut you down to two. If there were more than two, you may have to remind us. So I'm not. I'll take a stab at least your first question is a pretty easy one. So like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the mitigation that has been provided so far has been from the fallowing or drying up of irrigated lands. So those irrigation water rights have irrigation seasons of use. So roughly April through September or October. So that water gets put in stream, and you see these big benefits in the summertime. Whereas the groundwater uses, we've issued 127 permits, and 116 of those are still active. The impact of those permits is generally spread throughout the year. So, some of the wells are close to the river, but some of the wells are at quite a distance, and so their impacts are spread out over time. Yeah, and municipal uses are heavier users in the summertime, but they're also using water in the wintertime. So you get this result of some negative impacts in the winter and some big positive impacts in the summertime. So your second question, the second part of your question was a tougher one, and maybe that's why I've forgotten what it was.
So what I'm trying to look at is, as they try to understand ODF and W's concern about, not so much springs, but I thought they had some concerns about the lower flows actually in the winter. And how do
Yes.
we weigh the overall ecological benefit of our program that seems to me to have great benefits in the summer and somewhat little detriment perhaps in the winter, but I don't know what that means for fish and
Yeah, well, and quite frankly, I don't know if we can really say how that is weighed. I mean, you can see the numbers. There's a negative impact. It's small, much smaller than the positive impact in the summertime. So I'm kind of an optimistic person. I'd like to think over, if you annualize the benefit, there's a positive benefit, and it's pretty big. But there are negative impacts in the wintertime. So I don't want to downplay, ODF and W's concern. We need to talk to them about that and see if there's either an opportunity to rectify that. Maybe that's going to come to us naturally from some of the things that some other folks are talking about. But it's answering those questions that is kind of the challenge between where we're at right now and adjusting the cap at some point in the future. How do we satisfy the concerns about springs and wintertime flows? Or to what degree do we satisfy those?
But statistically, they're very, very small. I mean, really insignificant as compared to the gains in the summertime.
But they could be, it's not significant in that season if it is a limiting factor for some biological thing in that season. Small gain, a fish that's on the edge, for example, or a frog that's on the edge, an incremental small gain in that season could be critical. I don't know, but I'm assuming that's what they're driving.
Yeah, we know they're concerned about them, and we're concerned about that, and we need to work with them and see what we can do about that.
It's critical fish life history components are outside the irrigation system.
And-
Sometimes it's just access and temperature.
Would the conversation about the cap and the program, that will be part of what the group in the Deschutes Basin is talking about? I mean, part of what the solutions might be going forward? Am I?
Well, I hope so. I mean, there's I think there are lots of folks involved, and not everyone has the same goals.
Right.
So it's, can we build on the common good and take care of most or all of everyone's goals. There are some short-term needs related to the spotted frog that the districts are working on. Whereas the municipalities are, in the short term, interested at an improving market from their perspective on being able to obtain mitigation credits at a more reasonable price. Especially Lapine, Adam, told you about their experience, recent experience buying mitigation credits at $10,000 a pop. So, that probably isn't sustainable for the city of Lapine and the growth that they're looking at. So.
Just for my background, because I have lost this bit of knowledge along the way, are the mitigation credits one-to-one?
Yes.
I mean, they are. That's what I thought. But there was something on one of those slides that made me think maybe they weren't.
Well, that's because municipalities aren't one-to-one, or municipal and quasi-municipal water is not one-to-one, that's consumptive use, so you won't see a one-to-one.
Oh, okay.
When you talk about, so I think I know what you're talking about.
It's the same
You're talking
slide
about
that Joe was talking
that.
about. This
You're
one,
talking
yeah.
about that right there, yeah. So they're mostly like 40% consumptive use. It's based on their consumptive use, not acre for acre, or acre, 1 acre, 1 mitigation credit for 1 acre foot of water, like an irrigation.
So an irrigation user is one-to-one, and
Yes.
a municipal,
Is based on consumptive use only.
oh, okay.
That's why you see that difference there.
Okay.
I thought this just reflected a good water year. Is that not the case? I thought this.
Well, it's excellent if you look at the actual use that they're pumping. I mean, they're actually, based on the mitigation provided, the municipal and quasi-municipal users, they provided 5,851.3 credits. They're allowed to use that much water. They only use 2,420. To me, that's good.
Right, but isn't that just because 2017 was a good water year?
Well, it's also based on their incremental development.
Yeah. Commissioner Mull, those that can participate in the incremental part of the mitigation program, it's up to them to decide how much of their permits at this next year they want to use, and they have to provide mitigation for that. So they don't necessarily know how much they're going to use. That's the good water part. But another part of it is just longer-term planning and saying, I want to take care of my needs for the next several years right now. So I'm going to lock that mitigation up and get it tied down with the department. And now I've got the next several years, I'm good to go. So we might see this, the relationship of these bars kind of change over time with how far ahead the municipalities are planning and the kind of relevant water year that they may have. The municipality's goal is they never want to be in a situation where they can't meet everybody's needs at a given time. Sure, that happens, and they plan for that eventuality, but it's their goal to have more pumping capacity and opportunity than they might need. So that too is part of what you're seeing there, is just the buffer or the safety zone for several different municipalities at one time.
Can I just ask for a clarification? Maybe I missed this, but with temporary mitigation, is that a one-to-one?
Yeah, it's still.
It's 2-for-1.
Well, it's 2-for-1, yes. Yes, it's 2-for-1 because the mitigation bank holds a reserve credit for every temporary credit there is. So it's 2-for-1 on when you're buying a temporary mitigation credit. Good question.
Thank you. Other questions? I guess not. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next is a legislative update. And we
Good afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, Raquel Rancier, Senior Policy Coordinator with the Oregon Water Resources Department. I'm glad that all of you have a sense of humor. So I was going to change this picture, which I think I used during my last legislative update, and then I just realized that I just wanted to hope for snow. So I figured the rest of us would be in that same frame of mind, and that we really just needed the picture to be there so we could remember that occasionally we do get good snow years.
What year was it?
Oh, I don't remember which year this
16.
was.
Must have been 16.
It could have been 17, 16, I don't remember. So anyways, and I figured it would wake us all up, being late in the day, to remember snow, and that occasionally we get snow here in the Willamette Valley. It's not looking good for this year, so. Okay, so today we're going to talk about, just briefly, the 2018 Emergency Board, and then we'll talk about 2019 legislative session and timelines. Just remind all of you about the 2019 legislative session, WRD legislative concepts, and then also a quick reminder about the agency request budget pops. So that's what we're looking at for the rest of the afternoon here. I think all of you are aware of this, but we did go to the emergency board during the 2018 September legislative days, and we've been talking about our legal expenses for a while now, I guess, is probably the reality, and our concerns about this biennium. And as you all probably recall, our base budget is $835,000. We've been spending it approximately, I think our base budget would break down to about $35,000. We were spending around $80,000 to $85,000 on average per month. So we did end up going to the emergency board and requesting an additional $1.3 million to address those legal expenses for the remainder of the biennium. So I'll note that that is just a one-time, is my understanding, and so we'll still be having these conversations down the line. This is for this biennium. You also, yes?
Just a question on that, Raquel. So what was that conversation like? I mean, did they want to know what is going on? Why do you have such giant legal bills, or?
Chair Reeves, Commissioners, we have been having this conversation for a while. You'll probably recall that we had in our agency request budget for the 2017, when we were at the legislature, we had a discussion about this as well as a policy option package. And then we spent quite a bit of time meeting with legislators, and we started this over a year ago, continuing that conversation, continuing the conversation going into the 2018 session. And I don't think, by the time we got to the actual request, people had heard about it several times in many different forums, and so I don't think there was a lot of questions from that standpoint. I think a lot of people understand that a lot of these costs are coming from regulation and distribution in the Klamath Basin, and we've had a lot of those conversations about that to bring them along. So from that standpoint, it was, they knew what was coming, so.
Thank you.
Okay. So you'll see in the picture here, because I decided I needed a different picture than the one that was from the snowy days, we were also at the legislature during legislative days talking about dam safety, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation. But you'll see there's Keith Mills and myself up in Senate Veterans and Emergency Preparedness talking about dam safety in Oregon. So in terms of next steps around before the 2019 session, there is another legislative days in December, and that's December 12th and 14th. And we do have, we're waiting to hear back whether or not we will be going to the emergency board for two items. One, there was a budget note report on dam safety that we were required to submit. We have submitted that, and I did make a note that I don't think we've shared it with all of you, so we'll share it with all of you so that you know what we've been talking about with the legislature on dam safety issues. And then, so we may or may not have to attend to present on that, but they will be at least reviewing that report. The other item that may be before the emergency board that we're still waiting to hear back on is when we go to apply for a federal grant, we have to get approval for applying from the legislature. And so we have an interest in applying for funding from essentially the National Groundwater Monitoring Network program. And this is really related to groundwater specific issues. And so we can, I think it's up to $150,000 that we can receive through this grant. So that's something that we're currently talking about with the legislature and may or may not be up in front of e-board in December. Okay, so the rest of this is all focused on 2019 legislative session. So as you all probably recall, we've talked about legislative concepts as well as budget a couple times prior to this meeting, and we submitted our draft of legislative concepts in April, and then some of them were submitted in June because they were placeholders. We'll talk more about those again today. We also submitted our agency request budget in August, which had the POPs, and we talked about those, I think, at our June meeting. If you go on our website, you can see the POPs in full. We didn't provide them in full, but you do have a list in your staff report, and I'll put a list up here on the screen shortly. So the next step in the process is we're all awaiting the governor's recommended budget. So as you may recall, on the budget front, agencies prepare an agency request budget. This go round, it's always a little bit different depending on the direction we see from the governor's office. This go round, there was no cap on what we could request in that. So you recall we had quite a few POPs, policy option packages, around where we'd like to see additional resources. You may also recall that the Secretary of State's audit said that we should be articulating what the needs are. So the agency request budget did include quite a bit of POPs, and then the next step then is for the governor to prepare a budget. And so that's what we're awaiting. They moved it up in your staff report. I think it says December 1st. They've moved it up a couple days. It's now November 28th that we expect it to come out. So those few days I feel like are great. So I had to change it here in the slides for all of you. And then after that, obviously the governor's budget will come out, and then that's kind of the starting point for negotiations between the governor's office and the legislature. But ultimately, it's the legislature that has control over the budget and approving it. So we won't know the final outcome of our budget until June of next year. So moving back over to legislative concepts. December 7th is the filing date for legislative concepts. If they're approved for filing by the governor's office, they will go ahead and file them for us. So as a note for this entire presentation, any of our legislative concepts, if they aren't approved by the governor's office for filing, then they will not move forward. We haven't gotten any indication that at this point that they won't be filed, but I do want to make sure that that that's clear, that there is still a chance that they might not be. So January is then when we have organizational days. That's when January 14th through 16th, that's when the legislature will get together and swear in new members, do all that kind of pre-work that they do before the legislative session. We don't know when committee assignments will be announced, but that's usually the part that we're always waiting for. I have been hearing that there may be change-ups, but I don't know if they'll be specific to the committees that we work with, so we're just waiting to hear that. So then January 22nd is when the 2019 legislative session begins. I'll note that this is the first year that the legislative session is beginning in January. And it used to start around February 1st, and I think it was the 2017 session, they passed legislation to move it up a bit because they kept running into the 4th of July holiday, and everybody wants to be out by the 4th of July. So it's been moved up a little bit, so we'll actually be starting in January. And sessions can last up to 180 days, and so that would be June 30th if they go for all 180 days. Okay, so now we're going to move into the department's legislative concepts. If you take a look at the attachments that were included in the staff report, I did not put a lot of details up here on the screen on each one, with the exception of dam safety. So that's why your attachments on the screen are out of order, is because we will have more slides on dam safety because it's a pretty comprehensive bill. But the other two I'm just going to talk about at a high level and refer you to your handouts. So extending the sunset on place-based planning, I probably don't need to talk more about this one. You heard a great presentation this morning about place-based planning. I'll note that so this is one of our legislative concepts that we have, and as we get more information about the governor's recommended budget and these are approved for filing, we'll then be turning our attention to working with the stakeholders, the planning groups that you heard from this morning, on trying to move those concepts forward. Yes.
A question on that. You said something this morning that I just wonder if we're talking about that while we're about the benefit of this, like expanding this science back that we just had to secure, what, $1.3 million in legal fees, and we see this as a way to reduce that. And are we tying those two together, or is that too big a risk? It seems like there's a great connection.
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, we haven't directly tied those together. We've talked about place-based planning in the context of potential, that could be one of the potential benefits, is reducing conflict in a basin or preventing conflict in a basin, but we haven't tied those two directly, as I think you're proposing here.
I think you talked about it.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of, as you saw today, there's a pretty positive story to talk about with place-based planning. And the conveners, some of them have been meeting with legislators, and I think that every time I talk to them, it's pretty invigorating. So I think having them tell their story is really the key and important for continuing place-based planning in the future. So I don't know that I necessarily need to talk more on this one. We're proposing to extend our existing authorities for place-based planning. We then also have, as a reminder, an associated POP, policy option package, which would provide additional funding for the place-based planning efforts. So the next one is transfers of the type of stored water. So this one we talked a little bit about at the last commission meeting. As a reminder, back in, I guess, the 2018 session, there was an interest in legislation, or someone had proposed legislation that would allow for changes to storage rights. So if you recall, we have a storage right, which is the right to store water, and then you can get a live flow right. So we tend to refer those as S rights versus R rights, which would be the reservoir storage rights. And then if you want to use water from that reservoir, you would get a secondary right, which again is an S right. The issue that has arisen is on the storage rights, so those R rights. And basically, we, for a while, we had, in some instances, approved changes to those R rights. And in looking at our authorities more closely, it does not appear that we have clear authority to do that. So the effort now is to, for the department's legislative concept, is to allow changes to those reservoir rights to the character of use. So the issue is broader than that, and I'll talk about that briefly. But we put forward the character of use because we have been investing in the Willamette project, which that's tied to, and there's some other activities where we know there's going to be a need to do that. And then it's also what we've more commonly done, and I think there's a general agreement that this is something the department should be able to do. On changing the location of a reservoir, there is a work group that is talking about that issue and getting into the details of that, and so that's not included in our legislative concept. Certainly if that group were to find a solution to all of the issues, then our LC may not end up being needed at the end of the day. So let me give you just a reminder and as an example. If you have a storage right, usually that storage right will say on it, here's the location of the dam. So that would be part of the location. Here's the area to be inundated. And then it will have the uses that storage right is storing water for. So if it's storing for irrigation or storing for municipal, fish and wildlife purposes, currently, because of the interpretation of the statutes now, if you have a right to store water for irrigation, and let's say you would like to allow some of that stored water to be used for a municipal purpose or for fish and wildlife, we can't change that right now. So that's the issue that this particular legislative concept is trying to address. And then again, the work group is trying to address the other issues around points of diversion as well as the location. And if there's a solution that encapsulates this one, then we'll see what happens. So, any questions on that particular issue? Yes.
Being ignorant, my assumption is that none of those should be a problem, and there shouldn't be, from an opposition or non-support standpoint. Is that naive?
Chair Reeves and Commissioner, so none of those, I'm going to assume you mean changes to a storage right, the place of use, or the location of storage, the point of diversion, and then the type of use. The one where I think there is general consensus is changes to the type of use. The location issue is definitely contentious. So there's not agreement on that issue to date. So let me give you an example of a couple scenarios so you can kind of visualize this. If you think about someone that has a pond on their property, for example, let's say it's a goldfish pond, tiny pond, right? If they wanted to move, and they had a water right for it, if they wanted to move that right from one corner of their property to another corner, that could be one scenario where they'd want to change the location. Different scenario could be you want to take a portion of Since we're on this side of the mountains, we'll talk about Detroit Reservoir. Let's say you want to take a portion of Detroit Reservoir, and instead of storing the water in Detroit Reservoir, you want to store it in a reservoir somewhere lower in the basin, or maybe somewhere high in the basin, right? So this could be downstream or upstream that people are thinking about. And it could be a portion of the water. It might just be 1 acre foot. Or, and this, we all, I think in the work group discussions think this is very unlikely, but, or let's take like the big idea would be, well, what if we were to move Detroit, the entire reservoir, to a new location? And that one, everybody seems to think is not plausible, but also if it were, we'd probably want to talk about that one a little bit more than so those are the kinds of scenarios that we're talking about. And so remember, under a transfer, the standard is injury or enlargement. So that's what we're looking at. Are you going to injure other existing water rights, or are you enlarging that right, which you can't do? So that's really what's looked at. And so the question is that the appropriate standard when you're changing a location of a reservoir? Some folks say yes, some folks say no. And so that one's the one where there's a lot more discussion that's occurring.
Okay. There could be some discussion on the change of type too, depending on, I know in some scenarios we'd have in our area was changing from different type of use because the irrigation district requires a certain volume for the system to be able to distribute because of the way it's set up. And if individual landowners was wanting to change to say in stream so you didn't have that flow, that could be a contentious part, at least in some conditions. So
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Korn, I think I understand the scenario you're talking about, and so I think that particular scenario, the secondary rights are probably the rights that are of interest. So recall you have the primary storage right, that's what the water that's in the reservoir, and then you have secondary water rights. Those are the rights that are taking water out of the reservoir and applying it to the land, and I would suspect that that's probably where you may have individuals that are interested in doing maybe other things with those rights. So this is the actual storage right, which my guess probably in your area is probably held by either Bureau or is probably held by the district or districts. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Okay. All right, so now we're going to talk about dam safety, and that's attachment 2. And as you'll note there, these must be approved for filing by the governor's office. There's my disclaimer on there. So let's move into the dam safety legislative concept. This one, I'll have to commend Keith Mills, who I don't think he's in the room, so other folks can pass along that. But he has put certainly a lot of work into this and a lot of work into educating me. So on dam safety issues and getting my very novice questions around some of these things. So we'll talk briefly about this legislative concept, but I want to underscore just the importance of this issue. Why are we even looking at modernizing our dam safety statutes? Well, I think, the first thing is 1929 was really when the last major update was done to these statutes. In 2017, we finally got authority to do require emergency action plans. But that's really something that's very important. We just got that authority. So there's some other things that I think we need to look at and have the conversation around dam safety about. On record that we've actually documented, I think there's probably been about 55 failures since the 1800s in Oregon of dams. Fortunately, those have primarily really just impacted property, but that's something we want to keep in mind is on dam safety. Dams have great benefits to the state in terms of water storage. At the same time, they can pose risks. So that's just something that is in context. We want to balance those things of preserving that storage while also making sure that we're protecting the public and lives downstream, as well as property and infrastructure that's downstream. So on top of it, we also have aging dams. So a lot of our high hazard dams were built long ago, and certainly that's a concern for us. We're also learning more about seismic risks to dams, as well as floods in the Pacific Northwest. And so that's another piece that we're looking at as we're talking about dam safety that's changing the landscape for us. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about modernizing our statutes and what we're talking about on the legislative concept front. So the first bullet up there, this is adjusting and clarifying what our jurisdiction is. So this is really making clear that our focus is on non-federally regulated dams that store water or wastewater. So just as we've always done, we've inspected dams that have water rights. We've also inspected dams or had agreements for inspection of dams that store wastewater. We haven't been inspecting federally regulated dams. So we have a staff of 2 people. There's 960 plus dams in the state, 74 high hazard dams that we'd like to get to every year and are actually now required to get to every year for inspections. We do have some assistance from our water masters. However, we like to be efficient with our resources, and we're not regulating dams that are already regulated by the federal government's dam safety program. So part of it is clarifying what our statutes apply to, that we're not looking at federal dams. We are looking at water and wastewater structures. And then another piece to this is if you look at our current statutes, it's very broadly written to say dams, dikes, or other hydraulic structures. We don't have a record really of regulating dikes or other hydraulic structures. So what this proposes to do is take those structures out and move them into a new statute that was created in 2015 that was towards creating a voluntary program where the department could provide technical assistance as we had resources available to assist owners of levees. And so it moves those kinds of structures into that statute, which is not a regulatory statute, it's more of a technical assistance statute. So the next bullet is around approving modifications of dams and really the final engineering documentation. So what does that mean? Well, typically when we get, is currently with our statutes, when a new dam is proposed, they're required to submit their plans and specifications and get those approved by our dam safety engineer or dam safety program. And what is unclear is what if they're modifying that structure in a way that does not require a water right. So this is looking to make that clear that it still applies even then, that they need to get that kind of an approval. And then also that on the tail end of that process is once the structure is built, that they need to submit documentation that the dam was actually built as they had proposed it to be built. So that before they start to impound water or wastewater. So that's what we're looking to make sure it's clear in the statute that this applies regardless of whether or not there's a water right involved, as well as to those modifications. Okay. The next bullet down, you'll see notes fees for reviews of plans for dams. So when we get those plans in, if it's a high hazard dam, it takes about a month potentially to review those plans and specifications. That's a long time for a staff of 2. If it's a low-hazard dam, it's a couple days. But we're currently looking to recoup the cost around that. And so our dam safety program is funded by general fund dollars. It's funded by fees from current dam owners, and then it's funded in part by grants from FEMA. So this would recognize just the workload that's associated with these new structures or modifications and the time that takes to provide some a little additional resources to the dam safety program. The proposal does cap it, so we've done an average, and we've proposed to cap it based on low, medium, or high hazard, based on the average times that we've estimated. So, and it's either actual time not to exceed the cap. Yes.
A quick question on the fee. You make the clarification about who the state's going to authority and not have federal regulated establishments. Take it, you can't hear me, so.
Thank you, that helps.
So my question is, are you going to make the same distinction on fees, that you wouldn't charge a fee for those dams that are federally regulated as well?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, yes. So what we're essentially proposing to do is on the federal dams, basically the entire dam safety statutes section doesn't apply to them. And I think the only provision that is included is that we can provide technical assistance on inspections, I think, of their dams if requested. And we've also discussed being able to provide assistance in the event that there is an emergency at one of their dams. But from a regulatory standpoint, they're completely not included in that.
Just a clarification, did I hear a month for one of the high hazard dam reviews?
Chair Reeves, yes. Commissioner, yes.
So how does that square with 72 high hazard dams that need to be reviewed annually? How does that add up?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, so the 74, I think we have high hazard dams that in the state. Those are annual inspections that we do. That is not this particular provision here. So we already have a fee for existing dams. This fee that we're talking about here would be a one-time fee, and it's when you propose to construct a new dam.
That's the 1 month. That's the 1 month.
Yes, that's the 1 month. Inspections do not take a month, thankfully. Yes.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So the next one provides guidance. So really, if you look at our statutes, it doesn't talk about what the responsibilities are if you're an owner of a dam. So we're looking to provide a little bit more clarity for owners to understand their responsibilities. For example, that it's your responsibility to maintain your structure. If there is an emergency at the dam, then you need to take actions to prevent failure of that structure. So that's just some of the items that are included in that. The other part then is clarifying the department's general authorities related to the dam safety program. So this gets at entering property, warrants, clarifying those authorities. It also clarifies actions that we can take during an emergency, and then also clarifies that we can enter into agreements, that we can obtain, accept monies to assist with the dam safety program. So some of those things that I think are fairly implied, but making sure that that's clear in the law as well. Before I guess I switch slides, was there any other questions on these first few bullets, and then we'll switch gears to the next one? Okay. Okay. So this next piece would be something new for the department. Currently, there's no provisions around removing a dam. So what we're looking at here is, it's fairly narrow, but looking at requiring an owner to submit their plan for removal to our dam safety program for approval. This is on significant and high-hazard dams, is my recollection. And so if you may recall that high-hazard dams are dams that would likely result in loss of lives if they were to fail. Significant hazard dams, they're unlikely to result in loss of life, but they would likely result in significant property or infrastructure damage. So those are the two ones that we tend to focus on throughout the rest of this LC. And the low-hazard ones, there's low likelihood of significant property damage or loss of lives. So that's why those ones are our lower priorities. So with this one, it's again just looking at making sure that they have a plan for removal, that they're protecting lives and property downstream as they do that removal. And if necessary, that they have an engineer that's supervising that removal, again, with the interest of protecting lives and property. So this next bullet here has actually a lot of components to it.
Sorry, can I ask?
Yeah,
I'm
certainly.
curious, what, is it just that nexus to the high hazard nature that limits it to people and property? I mean, dam removal for ecological benefit, for example, it doesn't apply?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, this is basically just the plan for removal to make sure that as they're doing that removal, that it's safe. This isn't proposing to make a judgment as to whether or not that dam should be removed based on ecological provisions.
Okay, I think I understand. This isn't getting at approval of the reason for dam removal.
Right.
Any dam removal that's proposed, you're saying we don't have clear authority to step in and say the removal isn't safe, and we're trying to get that authority. Okay.
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, yes, that's correct. Okay, so this next one here is really the big one. So currently, after we do an inspection, we send out a letter to the owner saying, here's what we found, here's what the problems are. If we find that a dam is unsafe, so that's where our authority is if a dam is unsafe, what the statute says is then we must send a notice to the owner and schedule a hearing. So that is the first step. It doesn't say provide an opportunity for a hearing. It says we'll schedule a hearing. So, and then you go through that hearings process, and then you can issue an order, and then you just get this kind of broad authority. It doesn't talk anything about authority around requiring people to maintain their structures, so you don't get into that situation in the first place. It doesn't provide much latitude from the standpoint of we've learned quite a bit now about seismic issues in the state, and we do have some owners that have gone from a position of thinking that their dam is in good operating condition and has maintained that structure, and now we know something about Cascadia, and now they're suddenly facing a significant potential investment in these structures that has been obviously not foreseen. So what we're looking at doing here is providing more tools in the toolbox. So on maintenance issues, for example, if the owner has not addressed maintenance issues consistently in inspections, and we've said that they should address those issues in prior inspection reports, this proposes to give us authority to issue an order to direct them to fix the maintenance issues. And these are maintenance issues that, if they're left unaddressed over time, could result in the structure becoming unsafe. So that's, again, trying to prevent us from getting to the scenario where we have dams that are becoming unsafe in the state. If they don't address those maintenance issues, then the proposal would be there's currently no civil penalty authority associated with the dam safety program. So this then provides, again, an option for us to help get them to move in the right direction by issuing civil penalties, which connects to the next bullet down, by the way. So that's maintenance issues. The second piece to it then is providing us with the option to be able to work collaboratively with these owners. So recall the scenario where you have someone that has a dam that's, as long as we don't have an earthquake, it's in good condition, right? So how do we work with them to get those issues addressed? We don't necessarily want to go directly to a final order saying you need to fix this right away. We want to work with them. So this is providing us that option to be able to work with them and work through those issues. And then the third piece to it is then if a dam is unsafe, we can, instead of issuing or setting a hearing, this allows us to issue a proposed final order, inform the owner that they have the opportunity to request a hearing. So if both parties agree that a hearing is not required, then we can save the owner and ourselves some of the costs and time associated with that. It does provide the option to the Office of Administrative Hearings that if it is an unsafe dam, that they can expedite that to the extent that they can in the process. And then it also provides us with the authority to go to the court. If we think action is needed immediately, we can go to the court to seek an injunction. So, so that's the suite of tools. Instead of just having the one blunt tool that gives us a lot of authority after we've gone through, a hearing, this gives us more of a suite of tools. By the way, with the orders, they can request a hearing, so we're not reducing due process through this. So questions on that? Like I said, that one's the big one.
Well, I just had one question on the high hazard dams that they inspect every year. You said they get a letter. Do they get a letter every year updating the status, or just when there's a change in status?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Corn, that's a great question, and I'm not sure. I think we send a letter after every inspection, but I'm not sure on that. I'm going to see if Brenda's still in the room. And she says yes. So, so yes, they get a letter every year after an inspection.
And then another question, it says after a failure or whatever that they can take action. If they think the failure is imminent, does this cover that the action can be taken to preemptively, that it appears that there's a problem that needs corrective action?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Corn, yes, all of these scenarios are actually before a failure.
Okay.
So the goal is to prevent the failure, right? So if it's failing, I guess is maybe the way to say it, we want to be able to take those actions to prevent that failure. Again, we want to protect lives and property downstream. So that's really, if it's already failed, then we're in a different position. Yeah.
And just for my clarity, action could mean draining the reservoir to a certain point that reduces the load. It may not be remove the dam. So, and I think that's an important part of the dialogue is
Chair Reeves, Commissioner, yes, that's a great point. So if you look at the actions that we've taken in the past and even that are in our current statutes and then that's in the proposal, is it could be anything from mandating that they not exceed a certain water level. So we have that scenario. You all saw Wallowa Lake Dam. That was the scenario. It could be that they can't store until they fix the issue. There's a variety of things that could be the case, and it's obviously going to be specific to the dam and the risk and the specific scenario that we're seeing. Okay, so the next piece here is civil penalty authority. I mentioned a portion of the civil penalty authority related to maintenance issues. We're not proposing that the civil penalty authority apply to individuals that have a dam that's unsafe or potentially unsafe, because at that point, we'd rather them focus their resources on fixing the issue. So So it's not proposed for that scenario. It is also proposed, though, to apply to, for example, failure to submit an emergency action plan. Today, our only recourse is to say please. So this would give us authority to, again, get folks moving in the right direction. It also would allow us to issue civil penalties if someone were to build a dam without going through the approval process.
So what kind of levels would the civil penalties be, and who sets those?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Corn, that's a great question. So we copied essentially from our existing civil penalty authorities, which says that we can, the civil penalty can be up to $5,000 per violation. And it also says that the Water Resources Commission shall establish the civil penalty levels, which is what we've done in other programs that have civil penalty authority. So it doesn't necessarily, that's the 5,000 is the cap. The commission could set anything below that.
So, and that'd be a one-time thing. I guess what I would think on something like that, if you had someone that was being belligerent and you had what you considered an unsafe situation, it'd almost be better to have ratchet it up, that if they don't meet it, then in another week or month, then it's another penalty type scenario. Is that something, since you're approaching this legislatively, that maybe the civil penalty section should be addressed?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Corn, that's a great question, and I'm not going to remember exactly how it's written, but there is a provision in there that for every day of the violation that they can.
Because we had a scenario like that here, as I recall, a couple of years ago with a person that had an illegal dam, and we really didn't have any, I mean, it was an ongoing thing for quite a while to get it resolved. I mean, to the point, there may have been criminal penalty on that one, as I recall. That was a few years ago.
I don't believe that was a dam safety issue on that one. I think that was
an illegal dam.
Yeah, water right issue.
Right.
Yeah, so I can read specifically what it says here is, so the penalty may not exceed $5,000 if a violation of the order is a continuing condition. Each day the condition continues is a separate violation. So it could accumulate over time. Our hope is that we don't have to use these, by the way, but we rarely do civil penalties, and I hope that will continue to be the case, but this does provide, someone asked us, well, how do you enforce your dam safety statutes? You don't have civil penalty authority, and I just thought, well, that's a great question. So, and the answer is we say please. And now, I should be clear on this. If we've reached the point where we've gone to a hearing and we've issued an order and we're in that part of the enforcement process, then there's definitely a lot more authority. But again, that's us working through the courts and issuing orders and directing people to do things.
I think this would be an extremely rare scenario, but it's kind of like what Bob was talking about that this morning, and another issue that you have to plan for the worst case, because once in a while those things do come up for a variety of reasons, whether somebody's in financial trouble or absentee owner. I mean, there's a lot of possible scenarios that if you're doing all the legislative work, it would be a good opportunity to try to get the statute to meet as many of the what-if scenarios as possible, I would think.
Yeah, Chair Reeves, Commissioner Corn, I think I really appreciate all the feedback, by the way. I think this is a very important issue for us. I think we've looked at the model dam safety statutes, we've looked at, where the gaps are, and we've tried to do the balancing of the authorities that we think we really need, knowing the costs associated with repairing a structure. And so we're walking that kind of fine line of making sure that we have the authorities we need to protect public safety and property and infrastructure. And on the same note, trying to also work with owners to address these issues, which can be very costly. So I guess there's one more bullet. Sorry, this was such a good conversation. I was like, well, we can finish up. So this last one is more just a note of when people see this legislation, assuming it gets approved for introduction, that there's some provisions in there that are current law that will look new. And that is because we've made so many changes that, and working with legislative council, they said, you know what, we're just going to repeal all of the existing statutes. And that way, because part of our critique was like, well, we want this to make sense in terms of readability in the ordering. And so if we were trying to amend the current statutes, it just wasn't working. So you'll see some that are verbatim the same language that's in the statutes today, but it looks new and it's a current authority. So I'm putting that out there just because I think there are some provisions that we already have that people say, oh, I didn't realize you had that authority. And in fact, it is existing authority for us. So any other comments or questions on this? I think we'll move on to budget if there isn't. Yeah.
Well, is this something I would think would be fairly non-controversial? Is this something that you think will sail through, so to speak, or is this something that is going to be a difficult task to get through the legislature? It seems like these are common sense things that the majority would buy into fairly easily. Is that your read on it or no?
Chair Reeves, Commissioner Korn, I think there's always, so we've worked with a stakeholder group, and we've gotten great feedback from them. I think where you'll see fees are always a concern. So that was certainly, of this entire legislative concept, the most conversation was around the proposal for fees. I think the other issues are, we've gotten some feedback from owners of dams. One, I think they're in the category of having a dam but for the seismic issues, they would be in a very different situation if we hadn't discovered the Cascadia subduction potential for this area. And so they're now looking at potentially, I think, a cost of 40 to 70 million, somewhere in there, for small community. So, they're trying to grapple with that. So I think, the balance, as I noted, there's the balancing act of recognizing the challenges that some owners are facing on one end, and then recognizing the need for additional tools. And so I think there's can be some nervousness around, are you just going to come in and tell me to fix it when I'm sitting here working on trying to find a solution to fund it? And so obviously that's not what we're looking to do.
Well, and that future, yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you're having to replace your entire dam, you're talking about a lot of money. So, but that may tie to future legislative goals we have about getting more capital funds out there, and maybe there's a specific tie to the dam safety program, since we're focused in this piece.
Yeah, Chair Reeves, Commissioner, that's a great point. And so if you look at the Integrated Water Resources Strategy, there's a number of recommendations within that recommended action on dam safety. And this legislative concept addresses almost all of them. The area that it doesn't address is the funding issue related to the need to repair or rehab these structures. And that conversation, I did note, there's a budget note that, is everybody familiar with what a budget note is? Maybe I should explain that. So a budget note is essentially the legislature directing the agency to do something. So in this example, and it usually comes from the budget committee, since that's why it's called a budget note. So during the 2018 session, one of the budget notes that came out of the Joint Ways and Means Committee was a direction for the department to prepare a report around dam safety. And specifically, they were looking at wanting to know the costs to repair high hazard dams. They were focused primarily on publicly owned high hazard dams in the state. And so I think that's kind of queuing up that conversation because there are some entities that are looking to address their issues and are noting the funding challenges. So I'll distribute that budget note report to all of you so that you have a copy of it. Okay. All right, so I wasn't planning on talking much around the policy option packages because really where we're at now is we're awaiting the governor's recommended budget, and the governor's recommended budget can take our PUPs and modify them. So this is more just as a reminder that we do have these posted on our website. This is what we had submitted in the agency request budget. I did remember to put numbers on them. So I know there was a lot of discussion around what the numbers were on them. So the slides actually have numbers on them. I thought I did in the staff report and I didn't. So my apologies on that. But as you can see here, we do have, the place-based planning one was our number one that we had submitted, followed by groundwater. And this was in part from some of the conversations we had with the commission in terms of how we prioritize these. So I won't go into more detail unless you want me to around the policy option packages. These are the second set, other than to note that we're at that point where we're waiting to see what's included in the governor's recommended budget. They can take none of these. It would be great if they wanted to take all of them, but we already know that that's not going to be the case. So they could modify them, and so we'll see what comes out of that process, knowing that it is likely to be a challenging budget year. So with that, any other questions?
It sounds like there are no more questions. Thank you. Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you.
And I think we are adjourned. So we all know what the